Professor P.L.O. Lumumba is a man of great stature and a scholar highly respected as a figure of intellectual courage, particularly in Africa. Marginalized peoples in Ethiopia, particularly Oromo, are pleased to come to know of him and his work. One of the rarest qualities amongst contemporary political thinkers of any race or ideological leaning is, in my opinion, intellectual courage. The ability to deal with what is real, as opposed to what is proclaimed to be real, or what we want to be real, or what we wish were true, as is the case of the dominant Ethiopian narrative. One of the most obvious examples of this ability of intellectual courage in Professor Lumumba is his embrace of a practical and ideological Pan-Africanist approach that is inclusive of the questions and quests of self-determination and liberation, as opposed to vilifying these struggles as anti-unity and anti-Pan-Africanism. We appreciate that the good professor has taken a closer look at the real conditions of the marginalized people in Ethiopia and has agreed to engage us on this challenging topic. It was via a beloved comrade and brother, Yusuf Hamba, that I personally was encouraged to sit with PLO and discuss the Oromo struggle for liberation. This happened many months ago, and what has stayed with me since, and I believe impresses anybody that has witnessed his work, is his dedication to investing in the next generation of Pan-Africanists. He does this by offering to young people his resources, regular and high-value platforms, and his own personal time and expertise through, but absolutely not limited to, his work with the PLO Lumumba Foundation. PLO is also chairman of the Farafina Investment Group in Monrovia, Liberia, and Economic Strategic Growth and Development Initiatives for Africa based in Nigeria. He's a prominent speaker, author, and has twice been named amongst the 100 most influential African leaders. The hope of this conference is to engage African scholars and thinkers who are committed to decolonial practice and who are courageous enough to deal with the real questions and struggles belonging to diverse African people, and when need be, imagine their futures beyond harmful state structures. The Oromo struggle is, I believe, and most OSA members believe, at a critical juncture, perhaps the most critical juncture since the 1980s. We need friends who are more than just sympathetic, but who make the effort to understand what our historic condition is and believe that what we fight for is just, fair, and true, and adds value to African political, social, and economic life. I am honored to say that we count PLO as amongst those friends. We are extremely pleased that he has accepted our invitation to join us today in this role, and we are all honored as I introduce him to our virtual audience and also to those who will hear this talk later on as our keynote speaker for this conference, whose theme is Recommitting to the Project of Decolonization. Professor Lumumba will speak on the topic of self-determination as the basis of sustainable unity. I know that we are on Zoom, but I encourage you all to please make him feel welcome. Galatoma, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sereti, and thank you, the brothers and sisters who are virtually present this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending on where you are located geographically. Let me start by saying how glad I am to join with you to discuss a topic which, upon a casual examination, may appear to be controversial, but which, when examined quite critically, is both legitimate and indeed very evergreen. Many Africans are now grappling, as they have over the years, with the question of self-determination. And many individuals who count themselves as Pan-Africanists are uncomfortable to discuss the question of self-determination, lest they be accused of being separationists. Yet, from where I sit, I hold the view that the subject of self-determination is not to be seen as mutually exclusive from the project or the philosophy of Pan-Africanism. And in order to appreciate this, we must understand that the modern African state is artificial. The modern African state labors under what some have described as the Bismarckian boundaries, named after the German Bismarck, at whose behest the infamous Berlin Conference was held in Berlin, Germany in 1884 through to 1885, when the states that we now know as African states were created in order to give the European powers at that time, the United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, France, and Italy, territories which they could exploit. It is therefore true that the boundaries that were created were both arbitrary and artificial. You only have to look at the current geographical location of different nationalities to appreciate the artificiality of these boundaries. That speaking of the Oromo, you'll find the Oromo in present-day Ethiopia, and you'll also find them in present-day Kenya. If you think about the Yoruba in Nigeria, you'll find them in Nigeria and also find them in Benin. If you think of the Mandinka or the Malinke, you'll find them in Liberia, you'll find them in Mali, you'll find them in the Gambia. You talk of the Luo, you'll find them in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and in Kenya. And this in itself defines how arbitrary and how artificial and how selfish and how narrow-minded and how diabolical the European powers were when they sat down in Berlin to create what were essentially spheres of influence from which they could get raw material. And when African countries in their artificial state fought and regained their independence, one of the major issues that preoccupied the 32 leaders who assembled in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, from the 24th to the 25th days of May 1963 was what to do with the artificial boundaries. When I read, I can still, courtesy of history, listen to the eloquence of Kwame Nkrumah, the eloquence of all the leaders of Haile Selassie, who was the host at that time, and others, arguing then as they did, that we recognize that these boundaries are artificial. We recognize that these boundaries were created by foreign powers to dominate us. But how would it be, they pose rhetorically, if we tried to interfere with these boundaries? It is Julius Kambarage Nyerere and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt at that time who said, if we try to interfere with these boundaries, we will be at conflict with one another. And therefore, it is our duty in these early days to hold these boundaries to be sacrosanct and inviolable. And the doctrine of the inviolability of the inherited colonial boundaries were inherited at that time on the assumption that the leaders and the peoples of the artificial states would then work hard to ensure that the artificiality notwithstanding, environments would be created in which the different nations now found and landlocked, if you may, or gridlocked within these states would have the opportunity to express themselves. That was in 1963. Another meeting took place a year later in Cairo in Egypt, And the doctrine of the inviolability of the colonial boundaries was once again reinforced. But we have to ask ourselves why it is that we have remained uncomfortable with these boundaries. You know, the entire struggle to regain independence was premised on the belief that once people regained independence, they would have the opportunity to express themselves in their culture, in their religion, that they would have the opportunity to pursue economic objectives, and that they would enjoy political freedom. Sometimes when I think about all these, my memory takes me back to the American Declaration of Independence, when the founding fathers of that another artificial nation sat down in Philadelphia, and the founding fathers said, and I paraphrase some of the opening words of this universal application, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's further that it is for these reasons that governments are instituted amongst men to help to achieve these ideals. And that if any government fails in this regard, it is the duty of the people to rise up and overthrow that government and to replace it with another. I am submitting to you, my brothers and sisters, that those words, immortal as they are, deep as they are resident in the minds and hearts of all men and of all nations. And history has demonstrated not once, not twice, that if any individual or groups of individuals are invested with the honor and privilege of presiding over a nation, and they stand in the way of a people's desire to pursue happiness, to pursue self-actualization, the result is as predictable as the rising and the setting of the sun. They will be resisted. The history of Ethiopia is known, and I need not belabor it. Those who are historians will remember that there are different versions, but modern day Ethiopia traces itself to the 13th century, to be exact, in the year 1270. We know what happened, the battles that were fought. We know how battles were mounted by external powers. We know that the Portuguese were present at one time. We know that the Italians came and that they were defeated at the Battle of Adua. We know that they tried to come again in 1935, and they succeeded for a moment. And we know that they were defeated. We know that the Ethiopian Empire was created. We know that in 1962, the country now known as Eritrea was annexed by Ethiopia. We know that Ethiopia is a multi-nation or a multi-ethnic nation. We know that they are the Oromo, and that the Oromos are the largest single community in Ethiopia, perhaps standing at 35%. We know that they are the Tigrinya. We know that they are the Amhara. We know that they are the Somalis. We know that Emperor Haile Selassie presided over that state until 1974. We know that the Derg regime came into power. We know that the Derg regime itself was visited with pain from the revolutionaries. We know that there was a new constitution which created different states. We know that in the current constitution, there is the right to pursue self-determination. We know that the Central government in Addis Ababa has been uncomfortable with that. We know that recently, and which is still current, that the current administration is indeed engaged in a fratricidal war with the Tigrinya. We know that there was a war with Eritrea. We know that Eritrea then parted ways. We know that the Oromo have been agitating. We know that there is dissatisfaction with the central government in Addis Ababa. We know that there is discomfort in Ethiopia. We know that these issues are as relevant and as topical as they are germane. The question then to ask, for those who look at Oromo and other nations that are seeking self-determination, is whether the claim for self-determination in the face of the doctrine of inviolability is an antithesis of what is described as Pan-Africanism, whose main agenda is to dissolve the boundaries and create an Africa which reads, in a manner of speaking, from one page. I belong to the school that believes that self-determination must be understood in different ways and in its classical sense. In that classical sense, self-determination must mean there are people who have one culture, a people who have one language, a people who have one identity, a people who have certain peculiarities and particularities must be given the opportunity to express themselves in a unique way. And that indeed it is when they are allowed to do that, that they are capable of becoming part of a larger whole, which will the best interests of the general public. In other words, me to be romantic about this, that if the ocean is as grand as it is, all these ethnicities or nations are like the little bubbles that make the nation, that make the ocean. Every bubble is unique in itself, but yet it is the bubbles combinedness that we talk about the nation. If one visits a forest, every tree is unique. Every tree has its own characteristics, but we only talk about the forest if we look at all those trees in their commonality and in their specificity and in their particularity. And therefore, it is not anathemic to talk about self-determination.